Hey fearsome friends, neighbours. We've all got them. Some are friendly, some become close friends. But others, you'd wish you'd never set eyes on. Here are 7 examples of neighbours from hell. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. So for a little background, I, a 24-year-old female, lives with my roommate, a 23-year-old female, in an apartment in the suburbs of Atlanta. As you may know, Atlanta is really dangerous and crime-riddled right now. So we have a Ring peephole camera, perfect for apartments, and a digital lock on our door for safety. So with that out of the way, on to the story. About 3 months ago, the sweet family from across the hall moved out, and a new neighbour moved in. His name is David, and let's just say that he's interesting. When we first saw him moving in, we were a bit taken aback by the sheer amount of stuff he was trying to fit into his 1-bedroom apartment. All of it was anime merch and Star Wars memorabilia, and he definitely gave me hoarder vibes. But regardless of that, it was not my business. When the moving trucks had left and a few days had passed, my roommate and I knocked on his door to give him a welcome to the neighbourhood gift basket, containing some baked foods, dog treats, poop bags for his dog, and a collection of seasonal candles. But apparently this was not the correct thing to do, because after that day, David became very creepy. It started out innocently enough. He would come to the door whenever he heard my roommate or I coming or going, so he could have a quick chat. Or he would come over regularly to ask for salt or sugar or toilet paper. Sometimes he would ask if we could come over and watch his dog. But during the past 2 weeks, things have really escalated. 2 weekends ago, we had been out late partying in the bars near the Braves Stadium, and we ended up getting home around 3 a.m., only to find David sitting at the top of the stairs waiting for us. He was acting all upset, asking us where we'd been, and requested that we tell him in the future if we were planning to be out past midnight. I laughed in his face, and he called me a mindless Stacy, whatever that is. He also asked for access to our Ring camera so he could make sure we were safe. So we laughed at him again and went into our apartment. The scary thing is, though, we checked the Ring the next morning, and he had been sat outside his apartment staring at our door for the rest of the night. When we saw that, we contacted the complex to let them know that he was acting this way, and it was scaring us, so they told us to contact the police. We did, and they told us to contact them if he made any threats. But since we lived in a shared space, they couldn't do anything until he'd actually entered our apartment or threatened us. I assume the complex said something to him though, because he left us alone for the next 5 days or so. However, this week he was out of control. He constantly sits outside of our apartment, and my roommate has started leaving for work an hour earlier so that she doesn't have to cross paths with him. I can't leave the apartment during the day because he's constantly waiting outside, and he's asked me out, left love letters on our door, on our cars and in our mailbox. I told him that I wasn't interested one time, and he told me that he would kill himself if I didn't go on a date with him. Of course I don't have that in writing, so the police won't do anything about it. But he's also put up a Ring doorbell of his own so he can track all of our movements, and will leave creepy, sexual notes when we're gone for us to find when we come home. What do we do? For now, my brother is staying over on our couch for the next few nights until we can have a meeting with my landlord, and we've collected all evidence and Ring footage so we can show how much this has progressed. I'm sure the landlord and the police think we're being dramatic little girls or whatever, but we're not going to take no for an answer. Either he leaves us or we break our lease and get our full security deposit back. We're also going to file for a temporary restraining order at the very minimum, because apparently that would be faster than going through the police. We met with our landlord last week, but unfortunately they aren't willing to work with us as much as we'd expected. They're not going to remove him from his unit, and as we didn't want to spend a ton of money to move, we asked if we could move units within the complex instead. The landlord offered us a 1-bedroom unit on the terrace level, so my roommate and I would have to share a room in what is basically the basement, which of course isn't ideal, We spoke to the police again, and they said that the notes and letters weren't enough to get someone on stalking or harassment, especially since he literally lives 3 feet away from us. He probably just thinks you're cute, they said. They did keep the Ring videos and said that they would contact us sometime this week after they'd reviewed all the footage. But in the meantime, we've both moved in with my parents. Shout out to them for being incredible. It really sucks having to spend $2,000 plus monthly on a place that you can't live in. We're actively looking for other apartments, but money is tight as we would have to buy out the current lease and pay to start a new one. My roommate and I met with the landlord again, and he doesn't agree that we're being stalked or harassed, and won't remove David from his unit. We explained that we really liked our unit and the complex, and that we couldn't really afford to move, but they wouldn't allow us to end our lease early without paying. The offer for the 1-bedroom apartment on the terrace level was still on the table, so if we decided to switch units and continue to live here without being harassed, we would have to share a bedroom in the basement of the building. This is not necessarily threatening, but something I have come to think about a few times over the past years. I was about 6 or 7 years old when my older friend and I were messing around the neighborhood, doing random stuff, when we decided to visit a lady who lived in a house on a street right below mine. The lady was about 26 to 30 years old, and we would visit her every once in a while. She would give us small gifts like old video games and makeup that she had lying around, and none of our families knew the lady, even though she'd lived there for a good decade beforehand. So it was pretty late in the day when we knocked on her door, and when she answered, we asked if we could come in. She told us that she had a boyfriend coming over, so my friend and I parted ways and just went home for the night. About an hour later, I was sitting on the sofa when I peered out of the window and looked down at her house. I spotted a man entering, and I didn't think much of it, other than it was the boyfriend she was talking about earlier. So eventually I went to my room and went to sleep. I wasn't really that tired though, so I went to look out my bedroom window, which had an even more direct view towards the lady's house. And that's when I saw the lady standing on her balcony with her boyfriend, who was on the ground, and she had a shovel in her hand, seeming like she was yelling at him. After about 5 minutes then, she went down to the guy's level on the floor of the balcony and began beating him in the head with the shovel. I watched completely frozen as she beat him pretty badly, and the guy ended up just laying on the ground. There was very visibly a lot of blood on the rocks around him, and he was wearing a white hoodie, so it showed up pretty clearly. I got my mum and showed her what I was witnessing, and she called the police. Obviously, after the incident, our parents didn't want us to visit the lady anymore, and we never did. It turned out that the lady had a long criminal record and was known to be extremely violent, something 6-year-old me didn't quite understand. So for Christmas I was dealing out cookies and cards to the neighborhood, including the lady. I don't remember the interaction between us very well, other than me knocking on her door wanting to give her my Christmas cards. But when she pulled me inside to come talk to her husband, a new boyfriend I'm assuming, he was sitting on the couch, and she asked me to repeat what I'd said to her about the cards to him. But at this point I was getting scared, so I ran out of the house and never returned again. Keep an eye on who your kids visit in your neighborhood. I've just had a creepy experience. Well, more to the point, my neighbor has. It was 10 p.m. and I was in my kitchen getting a drink. Looking through the blinds, I noticed that the car park was busier than the usual deathly silence. I live in a first-floor flat overlooking another small block and a 2-story maisonette, and as I was watching a security light come on up the street, I could now see a gentleman who was walking up our usually quiet road. However, what caught my attention was that he had his hood up and a mask pulled over his face. I kept watching as a car left the car park, and the man made a beeline for the corner, bottom flat, and cut through the bushes to stand facing the front window. He just stood there in the dark, looking through the blinds, and was there for what must have been 2 minutes. After that, he then walked around the side of the flat to near to where the main door was, and just as quickly as he'd got there, he was in the bush at the front, peering in through the window again. He stood there in the dark, intensely staring into a young couple's home, before turning to walk back out of the car park. Thinking this was really odd behaviour, I grabbed my shoes and ran out and down the stairs to see if I could get a closer look at him, just in case he came back, and once outside, I could see him walking down the road and into a side alley. Where I live, you can either go down the side alley or around a few houses, and it brings you out at the same side road that has another dark downhill alley. I ran the opposite direction to him and turned the corner as he was going down the second alley, and I proceeded to follow him down the steep sideway. Then he turned the corner, but was 20 feet in front of me, so by the time I turned the corner he was gone. He must have hopped a fence or hidden, as he was absolutely nowhere to be seen. I ran back to my car park, jumped in my car and drove round the block a couple of times, but with no luck of seeing him. Overall, it was a very odd experience, and he displayed very stalker-like behaviour. I let my neighbours know that they'd had a peeping visitor and left my car facing the open car park, so my dash cam could run just in case. So this happened about 2 years ago, and still to this day it makes me extremely uneasy. I live in a very family-friendly neighbourhood, and there's a school right up my street with a lot of walking paths around and a main path that's very close to the back of my house. I used to go out every night to smoke weed on the porch, and I didn't hide it very well, so I'm sure my closest neighbours knew what I was doing, as the smell was strong and I coughed a lot. But because the walking path was so close to my house, a lot of random people would often walk by, even late into the night when I was smoking. Most of the time there was no interaction, sometimes a simple hey, as someone walked by and made eye contact. But generally people kept to themselves. And as I said, the neighbourhood is friendly. However, one night I saw a short girl with a purple jacket at the top of my street. She crossed over to my side, walked down towards the path, and made her way past my house. And as she did, there was no eye contact made. She just kept going. I saw her a couple times after that over the span of about a month, and then it happened. I was out on the porch one night, about 10 minutes into my session, and I decided to watch YouTube on my phone. I had my headphones at full volume, when suddenly I felt very uneasy, like I needed to be fully alert at that moment. So I paused my video, and that's when I heard footsteps coming right at me. I quickly looked up and it was the purple coat girl, speed walking straight up to my porch towards me, her face completely expressionless. As soon as I made eye contact though, she did a 180 spin around, walking quickly away towards where she'd come from and not towards the path. I was so creeped out and disturbed by this encounter that I didn't go out to smoke at night for 2 months, and to this day I still don't understand what had happened. What did she want? Was she mad about me smoking weed so openly, or did she have more sinister intentions? I thankfully never saw her again after that, but I think of her often, and I worry that she lives close by and will attempt something again. So my name is Devraj, and I'm a 24-year-old male from India. The story I'm about to share with you took place in 2009, when I was just 12 years old. I was born in New York City as my father was working at an IT company there back then, and we lived in the outer part of the city. We were living in a 3-bedroom apartment, 4 to 6 families living in the same building. We all knew each other, except for one of the families who lived in the front of our apartment. They were a middle-aged couple who wouldn't talk to anyone, and as a kid I always got creepy vibes whenever I saw them or even passed the door to their apartment. There were several rumours about that couple that they were drug addicts, that they'd been in prison for years, and lots of other scary sounding things. However, what made me believe these rumours was the look the couple gave to us kids. Whenever they'd see any of us, they'd give this really creepy and weird smile like they were a psychopath. Then one day, one of the kids from our neighbourhood, who was my friend, went missing, and after the police investigation, it turned out that they had been kidnapped and tortured by the psychopath couple. I never knew too much detail about it, as my parents wouldn't let me, and eventually we didn't live in the US for much longer, moving back to India in 2012. Still, whenever I think about the smile that couple would give us, I get goosebumps, and I hope I won't be seeing them ever again. About 12 years ago, my boyfriend at the time and I found a cheap, quiet studio apartment to rent. It was practically free, but of course we had to maintain the 3 properties there and help our landlord out with his meals, or just drive him out to eat, where we'd be treated to a meal ourselves. The studio that we were moving into needed a large amount of renovation to be livable, and was situated on top of a hill, which was pretty quiet and isolated. Next to our house we had a neighbour who was about 150 feet away, and our landlord owned all 3 properties, which were within grounds that were about 3/4 of a football field. The landlord's girlfriend lived above the landlord's garage, and he was a really cool guy. We got free cable, water and power, and only had to pay for propane for heat and hot water, which was split between us and the neighbour. Now we didn't officially meet our new neighbour until a few weeks after moving in, where we all introduced ourselves and had a friendly chat. I only really got a chance to properly talk to her a couple of weeks after our initial meeting, and we stood around outside talking for almost an hour, when our renovations were brought up. It encouraged me to want to show her our work, so we headed inside our place for a small tour. It was a studio as mentioned, so you pretty much got the whole house tour by just stepping in through the front door. And that's when it began to become weird. The first thing she said on entering our apartment was, "Is that a used mattress?" as she pointed at our bed. Now if you know me, then you know that when it comes to beds, I keep them very clean. I mean, I like straight up use waterproof mattress covers, and always make sure the sheets are clean, etc. So her question really threw me, as I stared at our bright white clean mattress edge that was exposed as a result of me making the bed earlier that morning. All I could manage to say was, "No, actually it's brand new." We all had our varying work schedules, so I didn't really see her for another few weeks after that. But then the landlord's girlfriend pulled me aside one day. She told me that my neighbour had been telling her and the landlord that my boyfriend and I were known to have burgled houses. I was blown away and wondered why she would say that. Neither my boyfriend or I had even known anyone capable of that, let alone us. Now the neighbour's daughter turned out to be a cop, newly on the force, and she had been working in the jail for the first year and was still there. Supposedly that's how she knew what she thought she knew about us. All I could really say to the landlord and his girlfriend was the obvious fact that we weren't even capable of it, but couldn't even prove it except by having clean records. So we just dismissed it for the time being. After that, we began to notice the neighbour giving us dirty looks every now and then. So naturally, it was awkward when I had to go over to her place in order to collect her half of the propane bill. She gave me a check, and when I read her name aloud and looked into her eyes, I made an official mental note of who she was. Now, when I was about 16, which was about 12 years or so before moving in next door to her, I ended up at her house with my high school boyfriend for Thanksgiving. You see, my boyfriend at the time's parents were friends with her and her husband, and they had a daughter who was our age at the time. My boyfriend and I hung out with the daughter while the adults got drunk as they prepared dinner, and I barely remember interacting with any of the adults, except for, of course, at dinner. Yet after that evening, I was told by my boyfriend from his parents that I was no longer welcome back at this woman's house. Neither my boyfriend or I could possibly think why, but a couple of months later I did find out. Let's just say that I'd hit puberty early and wasn't exactly flat-chested, unfortunately, and it got me plenty of unwanted attention from guys, even older ones. My boyfriend's dad at that time enjoyed staring at my chest and was pretty open about it, so there was no surprise that on Thanksgiving that night, as both men were at the very least pretty buzzed on the beers, they made a point of noticing my chest. Obviously word got back to the women, and they weren't happy about it, understandably. On top of that, shortly before I'd moved in next door to her years later, her husband had divorced her, and she was bitter about it. I laughed at first upon reading the name on that check, and asked her if she was of the same last name that I had known in high school. She gave me a sideways smile and told me that she remembered exactly who I was, combined with the fact that the landlord's girlfriend had told me that I was the only tenant she'd ever had a problem with, and the worst was yet to come. It was just small things at first, like when I'd get home I'd always hit the lock button on my key fob to lock my car, which would make the horn honk once to confirm it. And every single time I would do that, she'd always have to hit her key fob from inside her house and make her car honk as well. The landlord then informed us that she'd requested my boyfriend and I stay completely off her property, and to not even knock on her door. But then, right after that request, she had our landlord ask us if we could go into her house whilst she was gone to set up a treadmill for her. She'd even left her front door unlocked for us to do it. Fast forward to one day when she had a friend stop by for a visit. However, he had a really weird look on his face as he came up our walkway. So naturally, my boyfriend and I looked at each other and asked him, "Why the face?" "Well," he said as he sat down on our porch, "your neighbour, some woman, took a picture of my license plate as soon as I parked up, then wanted to know if I was going to be spending the night here." In shock and bewilderment, we asked him what she looked like just to make doubly sure it was her. And yeah, of course it was. She'd taken pictures of our license plates too. After that, she became even more petty. She started trying to keep track of whenever one of us would even step over the line to her half of the driveway, and if she felt that one of us had driven up the driveway in front of her house too fast, she would scream at whoever it was. That got me up in her face yelling at her one time, and she'd even threatened to sue us once, because according to her, one of our cats was on her car and had scratched the paintwork. Now, I used a squirt bottle when I noticed the same cat on my similar dark-coloured, newer car one day, and no way were there scratches like she had described. I mean, you could see the clear coat where the cat's nails were, but it rubbed right off just by using a finger. I then started to worry about my 3 cats with her around, especially after one of my nosy, ditzier cats wandered into her house after she'd left her front door open. Whenever that cat would wander towards her house after that, I'd call him back if I happened to see him. That cat, though, disappeared shortly thereafter, as my boyfriend and I smelled something dead around the property a couple of months later after searching tirelessly for him, but we could never locate the source of that smell. Tensions between the 3 of us, and even the poor landlord and his girlfriend, were getting pretty high at that point. But it got worse one afternoon when I happened to catch her on our property. I was around the back side of the house talking to my boyfriend, but when I went to walk around to our front door, I caught her. She was crossing back over the driveway towards her house with this stupid, childlike guilty look on her face. Believe it or not, it actually took a couple of minutes for it to dawn on me that she had been sneaking around to the side of our house to eavesdrop on us. And come to think of it, that's about the time I started to hear strange noises outside our windows at night. Now, our mail situation was strange at that place, because there was only one mailbox for our address, which the 3 houses on that property shared, and there was only one key to the mailbox, which the landlord had. The landlord and his girlfriend didn't drive anymore, so usually my neighbour lady would get the mail from the box for everyone and drop it off over at the landlord's house so we could go and get it from him. So one fine day, I trotted over to the landlord's to see if a check had come in the mail. But he said it hadn't, and I could tell just by looking at the mail pile it wasn't there. It was a state check, so it looked kind of obvious amongst regular mail. But on my way out of his house, She was coming up the stairs on her way back in, so I asked her if she'd happened to have seen if my check had arrived, as I thought maybe that was why she was heading back up. But boy, did she explode on me. She started yelling at me that she had no idea what I was talking about, and I didn't understand her reaction at all until a couple of months later. I began to notice that I wasn't receiving certain important mail, like my new driver's license, vehicle tags for registration, and some pretty important social security paperwork. So I hatched a plan and informed the landlord of it first. Then the second person I clued in was our mailman, since it was a locked mailbox, and as there was only one key to said mailbox, my theory should have been easy to prove, and it was. The plan was to address an envelope to myself as if it were important mail. I'd planned to give it to the mailman directly at our mailbox, so it would be missing the postmark, but I hoped she'd overlook that small detail. Then after the mailman had deposited into our mailbox, I'd just have to wait for her to bring the mail to the landlord and see if she'd brought the planted letter. And sure enough, when I went to the landlord's to pick it up, it wasn't there. Excited to finally be able to make her face some consequences for her crappy actions, I immediately called the postmaster to report the mail theft. But unfortunately, being the beginning of the recession back then, the post offices were far too understaffed to even explore the case, so I tried calling the sheriff, but mail theft is a federal territory. I then started to notice that the noises outside my windows at night were happening more frequently. And not only that, but I began waking up during the night with severe stomach pains and diarrhea that would usually and thankfully be gone by morning. That would happen at least twice a month whilst living there. Then one day, as I went out into my front yard to talk on my cell phone, as there was zero service inside, the neighbour lady suddenly appeared on her front porch and faced me, whilst holding her cell phone out towards me. I couldn't figure out if she was eavesdropping on my phone call, or maybe filming me. But after that, she would do it every time she was home and when I went out to make a phone call. On top of all that, it got worse when she'd recommended some lady friend of her daughter's and boyfriend to move into the landlord's above garage apartment, as apparently his girlfriend had suddenly moved out. So after all the trouble she'd be giving us, you would think that a nosy neighbour like that, who'd monitored our guests, would choose nice and safe people to live on our property with us. Right? Wrong. The new young couple tenants wreaked havoc. At first they'd gotten into the landlord's house while we were all out at dinner one night, and stole what they assumed to be the landlord's cell phone from his living room. But it was actually my recently deceased mother's cell phone that I'd lent to him, as the cell phone had about a year left on the contract agreement. Some of the last pictures of my mother and I were on that phone. I didn't actually find out it had been stolen until my boyfriend told me our landlord had told him. I remember that I was out in my field doing some tracking for a peeping Tom, which is a whole other story, when he came out to tell me, and I immediately yanked my phone out of my pocket and called the stolen phone. A younger sounding girl answered, but hung up after hearing me ask, "Who is this?" We both left my other house right away and headed to our studio so I could confront the young couple at their apartment. My boyfriend and I quietly crept up the stairs in the garage that led up to their front door, and as I stood quietly outside, I texted the phone that I thought they had stolen. I did that because that particular brand of phone had a certain text tone, exclusive to that type of phone only, and I knew that my mum had the phone set to that exact tone, and sure enough, I heard it go off inside their apartment. So I calmly knocked on their door and waited for them to answer. When the young girl came to the door, I calmly asked her about the phone. But before she could answer me, I explained to her that the phone that had been stolen was my mother's, and she had just recently died. I also explained that the phone had a few of the last pictures of my mum and I in it, but she denied having it, of course. Now, for all of you out there hearing this story, I just have to say that I tried, people. I tried. But I kind of lost it right then. I yelled bullshit. I texted it just now before I knocked, and I heard the text tone go off in your apartment. My boyfriend, who was standing behind me the whole time, tried to pull me back, as it was the landlord's house after all. And as all this was going on, her boyfriend happened to walk into their living room behind her. but as soon as he saw and heard me, he very quickly left the area. She kept on denying it though, and I just got more and more angry whilst yelling louder and louder. Eventually my boyfriend had to step in and basically pull me back down the stairs, where I then called the cops, as I had proof via the phone's location on a family share map, proving where it was, and also my online account had all their phone activity recorded on it. The cops even sneaked up the stairs to listen for my phone whilst I texted and called it. I found out from the officers that night that the couple were both searchable because of one being on parole and the other on felony probation. But although they ended up searching for over an hour in the small apartment, they unfortunately didn't get my phone back. I even told her that if she'd just email me the pics from the phone, she could just keep the phone and I wouldn't press charges and leave them alone. But no, I ended up with neither. The young couple didn't stop there. Thanks to the neighbour lady taking pictures of all my guests' license plates for security, and she said she was the one at risk. For their next performance, the young couple again broke into the landlord's house, stole his car keys and his car. As I said before though, our landlord couldn't drive himself, so that vehicle was what we used to take him out in. It was missing for around 4 days or so, and the cops eventually found it ditched in a nearby canyon. But as the landlord couldn't receive the call to inform him of the discovery of his car, they had to take it to impound to store it, costing him almost $3,000. After all that crap, I still had to live there part-time, as my mum's house that I'd inherited had no kitchen due to renovations, and during that time, the neighbour for some stupid reason let her huge German Shepherd out of its fenced area as soon as my 4-year-old son exited my car. It was a new dog to her, so I was appalled when it ran up toward my son, barking and growling. How would she know how the dog would react around strangers, let alone kids? Thankfully, I moved into my other house as soon as the renovations were done. After I moved out of that place and got far away from her, my intermittent diarrhea stopped completely, and the landlord even told me that she had calmed down completely after I'd left, even though my boyfriend still lived there. A nice peaceful ending, right? Well, not as far as I was concerned, it wasn't. Because one night I got a wild hair for some petty revenge. You see, there was a gate about halfway down the long, winding driveway. I had noticed there was also a chain on the pole that the gate was closed with, and that gave me an idea. I took an odd combination lock that I had lying around the house, and straight up locked her ass in the yard with it. Since the landlord couldn't drive himself out, and I had already taken him into town to get what he needed earlier that day, I knew that he'd be fine and well enough. Plus I knew he'd laugh his ass off when he heard of my little misdeed. I didn't get to see her stupid face when she realized that she couldn't leave for work the next morning, but I'll bet it was classic. From what I heard a little later, she'd reversed her car back up the windy driveway to fume to the landlord after she'd first realized that she was locked in. He said it was hilarious, and even more hilarious was the fact that it took her about 4 hours to get someone up there to cut the lock off so she could finally go to work. My life went back to normal after I moved out, thankfully, and the only thing any of us could come up with for how she was behaving was that she must have just been jealous of me after the things that her husband had said about my body back when I was 16 years old. Either way, though, that was definitely an experience. When I was about 24, I was always busy with work, and I lived in a small historic town, so needless to say I didn't get out very much, which is why I was really excited when my 30-something cousin came up from Fresno to visit. I was also excited when she wanted to go out to check out the scene on the first night that she stayed with me. It turned out that she was a drinker, so we headed out to hit up the few small bars in my town, but we only ended up finding one bar that was kind of happening. It had a pool table, and it allowed smoking inside, so we were sold. I decided to sit at the bar, and my cousin headed off to play pool with some guys. But as I was sitting there sipping my drink and checking my phone, I got a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see an older gentleman, who I didn't recognize right away, and upon seeing my puzzled look, he exclaimed, "It's me, Cody's dad." Instantly I realized that he was the father of a boy I had dated in the 8th grade, when I was about 14. His dad seemed nice enough, but I did remember that he was a pretty stern character back then. Sometimes as punishment for his son, he would have him dig trenches, even in the summertime, in the hard-pan rocky ground. I could even remember hanging out at his house back then, and just getting a bad feeling about his dad. Though I'd never experienced anything around him that would justify that feeling, of course I was surprised he'd even recognized me at all after all those years. He bought me a drink and we started catching up a little. And as we were talking, my cousin came over to check in with me, as she saw a much older man at the bar was speaking with me. Eventually he suggested that we go outside to smoke, as the bar was getting pretty smoky. But once we were outside, I realized we were pretty much alone. That was fine, I figured, as he was always one of my distant neighbours that I had known off and on over the years. But I figured wrong. I began to realize that he was beginning to ask me more personal questions, whether or not I had a boyfriend, or if I'd ever considered dating an older guy. I started getting uncomfortable, so I suggested that we go back in where it was a bit warmer. But again, after a few minutes, he wanted to go back outside. At that point, I was already trying to blow him off politely, and my cousin was seeing all of this as she was walking over again to check in with me. She gave me a sort of warning look before turning and walking back to her game of pool, and as the night progressed, he continued to try and get me to go outside with him, and this time he wanted to go to his truck. He finally grabbed my arm and just tried to pull me outside with him, and thank God for my cousin at that moment, as she seemed to have materialized out of nowhere and grabbed my other arm, yelling for him to F off. He immediately backed right off and disappeared into the small crowd towards the back exit, and for the rest of that night we enjoyed ourselves and had some much-needed fun. It wasn't until about 6 months later that I heard a horrifying story about him from another neighbour. I was told that he was now in prison, and probably for life. Apparently he'd been stalking and watching his soon-to-be ex-wife at their former home for months. Eventually he had decided to kidnap her, tying her up and gagging her. He then put her in his truck or back seat, not sure which, and drove her down towards Mexico, stopping off in Los Angeles, California. He decided that they should stop for the night, and this was about an 8-hour drive from our hometown. However, during that night in LA with this woman, he repeatedly raped, beat and tortured her, and he'd apparently told her that he was taking her to Mexico to kill her. He had been treating her that way for years, and I knew upon hearing that my bad feeling as a kid was justified. I'm now getting chills just writing this part. But somehow, though, she thankfully managed to escape his brutal attack that night, and he was arrested pretty quickly after that. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.